And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Out of the depths I cry to you. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications. The psalm for this morning is a cry for help, for redemption. We can be redeemed not only from sin, but from loneliness. We can be redeemed from sickness. We can be redeemed from isolation and imprisonment. I don't know about you, but for me, our situation this week has really started to sink in. It's probably because I did a funeral this week for one of our longtime beloved members, somebody who had been part of this congregation since childhood. And instead of being able to do it here in this sanctuary, in this place that she loved so much, it was graveside with just her children and their spouses. Even the grandchildren had to watch from their cars because of the limitations that have been put in place for contact because of the virus. And as the prayers began, a soft rain began to fall. It was not the send-off that any of us wanted for her. Suddenly, people we know and care about are waiting test results to see if they have COVID-19. And so with the psalmist, we say this morning, out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplication. We may be able to understand what is happening around us by looking at science, but we can't help but wonder where God is in all of this. Confronted with that difficult question, I always look to Jesus for help. And in the story we heard from John's Gospel this morning, Jesus too faces a difficult and painful situation. Jesus had some dear friends. Their names were Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. They were siblings. They cared about Jesus, and Jesus cared about them. So when Lazarus got sick, seriously ill, his sisters sent to Jesus, their friend, who healed the sick, and they asked him for help. But the area in which they lived, not that far from Jerusalem, wasn't a safe place for Jesus to go. He'd had some problems with the religious leaders there, and the last time he had been there, some folks picked up some stones and were ready to hurl them at him, to stone him to death. And he escaped with his life. So there was some debate, as you might understand, among the disciples about whether or not it was a good idea to return to Bethany. And whether it was because of this or, as John's Gospel relates, Jesus had some nudge from God. He waited 2 days before he left to go to his friends. By the time he got there, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, people of that time believed that when you died, your spirit hovered around your body for 3 days. But on the 4th day, there was no chance that it could possibly return. Your spirit was gone forever. There was nothing left to do for his family and his friends but to weep at his grave. Martha and Mary are devastated by their brother's death, and they feel as though Jesus has let them down. Lord, they say, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Mary breaks down and she cries, and all the family and friends who've gathered around to support them cry too. What happens next is difficult to translate from the Greek. It's something like Jesus shuddered, moved with deepest emotions. It could mean Jesus was angry at death and suffering and all their power that he saw at work in the world. Or it could mean that a great wave of sadness and grief washed over him as he saw the pain of those friends that he cared about and thought about his dead friend. Isn't that how it is with us when something terrible happens? It hurts and we're full of grief and pain, but there's anger there too. Why did this have to happen? And just like Martha and Mary, we want to ask God, where were you? Couldn't you have prevented this? Martha finds her only reason to hope is to wait for the resurrection of the dead, the resurrection of the righteous on the last day at the end of time, which no doubt seems a long way off. And Jesus, it seems as though the death of his friend had to be the hardest thing he'd faced in his life. Perhaps part of it was because he knew his own death was coming soon. He knew that he too was going to face the tomb. Where have you buried him? He asks. Lord, come and see, they tell him. And then comes the shortest and one of the most powerful verses in the entire Bible. Jesus wept. The same Word who was in the beginning with God, this same Word who was God, this Word through whom all things were made, the light and the life of the world, stands outside the newly made tomb of his friend and weeps. In grief, in anger, Jesus weeps. God knows what we feel. In Jesus Christ, God is with us and has been through it. When we face tough times, we have a God who knows what that's like. Some of those gathered saw Jesus' tears and knew he loved Lazarus. Others wondered where he had been all the last week. Jesus asks them to do the unthinkable. Take away the stone, he commands. Martha balks, and who can blame her? But they do as Jesus asks. They roll it back, and Jesus stands at the mouth of the cave and calls, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus does. His hands and feet still bound with bandages and his face covered with a cloth. Unbind him, Jesus says, and let him go. John shows us Jesus, a man who could be overwhelmed with anger and with grief, a man who broke down and cried at the pain of his friends, at the things that people suffer, at the evil that seems to have the upper hand. But John also shows us that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. As we are isolated, cut off from the physical presence of other people, from friends, from family members, coping with our fears and anxieties, we may identify just a little bit with Lazarus. Jesus raising his friend showed that resurrection to new life is not just something that comes to us at the last day or after our deaths, but it's something that the Lord does in human lives, even in the present. This is a story of hope, a story of new life. This time of grief and fear will not last forever. God will be calling us out into the light and into new life again. So I invite you this morning to share the faith of the psalmist. Don't be distracted by this psalm's talk of sin. The psalmist, I believe, is not groveling. That this is a prayer of a free and a forgiven human being who looks forward with longing and expectation to what God will do to help, to save, to redeem God's people. There are more situations that you can be redeemed from than sin. God wills to redeem us from loneliness, from sickness, from isolation. So as we are patient, as we do our best to be still, to do less, to move about as little as we can, we join the psalmist in these words of trust and hope. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in God's word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than those who watch for the morning, more than those who watch for the morning. Because with God there is unfailing love and great power to redeem. Amen.